4. More coffee. Bright morning light flooded the kitchen. Lucifer was in the sink, paws balanced on a dirty plate, licking the leaky faucet. Charlie poured coffee, noting the shine of Posey's bloodshot eyes and the restless way her leg moved under the table. She was still in the pajamas she'd been wearing the night before, adding unicorn-shaped slippers, their fur a stained gray. "Did you stay up all night?" Charlie asked, although the answer was obvious. "I found a new channel to follow." Posey's tone suggested she expected Charlie to argue with her. On the message boards Posey frequented and in the videos she sought out, dangerous advice was passed around on quickening one's shadow, the first step to becoming a glowmist. Most of the mainstream articles written about shadow magic were about alterations. Clickbait, like, "Is magic the new 1%? Hollywood actress starts new shadow trend. Rip out cravings for junk food at the root. Most useful shadow alterations for new moms. Is removing desire the new lobotomy?" In those stories, glowmists were the providers, the dealers, the grocery stores of magic, the old St. Nick's of magic. Celebrities had their shadows altered more frequently now that the trend had caught on, changing them like other people might change their haircuts, dressing up for the Met Ball with shadows in the shapes of dragons or swans or large hunting cats. They had their emotions triggered to better prepare for roles, or to be able to write more evocative songs. And if a few people starved to death or threw themselves off bridges or had so much of themselves removed they seemed to float through their days, that was a small price to pay. When shadows withered or burned up or failed to graft, the wealthy could always buy new ones. But dig a little deeper into the morass of links and articles, past the gloss of general interest, and you got to theories about how people became glowmists. Legitimate sources weighed in with a measured manner. A scientist from the Helmholtz Research Centers was quoted in a now viral interview in The New Yorker as saying, "Shadows are like the shades of the dead in Homer, needing blood to quicken them." But it seemed as though every wellness influencer and would-be wizard had a hunch to sell. YouTube and TikTok became crammed with bogus tutorials. How I woke my shadow with pain. Shadow quickening after fistfight. Magic ability discovered after drowning. Safe asphyxiation techniques with plastic bag. Guaranteed results. And in the depths of 8kun, the ideas were much weirder and much worse. Charlie could remember before, when actual magic had seemed impossible. And then the confusion when no one seemed to be sure what was real and what wasn't. But Posey had gone from a childhood belief in magic into an adulthood where magic was real, just denied to her. Charlie vividly recalled coming home to a bathtub half filled with melted ice, and her sister sitting on the floor, wrapped in a towel, her lips blue with cold. "I should have stayed in longer," Posey had told her, teeth chattering. Charlie begged her not to try anything like that again. Instead, Posey had gotten a piece of fishing line to tie to a tongue piercing and begin the slow and painful-looking process of splitting her tongue. Apparently, once you got used to using the muscles on both sides simultaneously, it trained your brain to a bifurcated consciousness. The second thing every glowmist needed, after a quickened shadow. As far as Charlie could tell, all Posey got out of it was a slight lisp. Charlie yawned and checked the messages on both her phones. On her real phone, there was an invitation to a barbecue from Laura, her closest friend from high school, who these days had 3 kids and not a lot of time. A plea to bartend at another friend's backyard wedding. Spam from a shop with a sale on Onyx charms. She took out her burner and texted Adam, giving things another try. "Can we meet up? Somewhere private. I don't want us to be spotted together." This was the tricky bit, getting him to bite. Once he told her where he was screwed. Then Doreen could go scream at him and drag him home. If only it could be that easy for Charlie to fix things for Posey. But there was no con or heist, no scam she could think of that would help. Tomorrow? With her car out of commission, that was going to be tight. "Sure," Charlie typed. "I can come over in the morning before class." No mornings. She ground her teeth in frustration. If she didn't know when he was going to be there, then she'd have to stake out the place. And since she was pretending to be Amber the Glow-Mist, it made no sense for her to even have some other job. Charlie decided to go for vague. "I have a thing until midnight. I can meet you after." He sent her a thumbs up and a winking emoji. When he followed up with the number of his hotel room at the MGM in Springfield, she felt a little guilty, as though she was scheduling a rendezvous. "You're not doing anything wrong," she told herself. Okay. She was doing something wrong, just not what it looked like. "Have you been paying attention to what I said at all?" Posey demanded. "Definitely," Charlie lied. Posey rolled her eyes and kicked the leg of Charlie's chair with a slippered foot. "There's this video where people take ayahuasca and are guided through waking their shadows. Everyone on the message boards are flipping out over it. I know someone with a lake house over by Lake Quinsigamond, and he wants a bunch of us to recreate it. If someone can get the DMT." Charlie raised her eyebrows. That's the stuff that makes you vomit all night. And grosser stuff. Posey shrugged. "Can you get it?" "DMT?" Charlie said, trying to decide how bad an idea it really was. "I don't know. Ask around Hampshire College. If someone is dealing it locally, they're dealing it there. Or maybe when you start at UMass, you can see if someone can synthesize you some in the biolab." Charlie's sister had spent the last few years binging Reddit threads, watching videos, and chatting with other Glow-Mist hopefuls until dawn. But lately, things had gotten worse. Posey had started staying up for days at a stretch and not leaving the house for weeks. Despair seemed to be chasing her heels as her shadow refused to quicken. She'd gone so deep down the rabbit hole that Charlie worried it had become an oubliette. That was why it was so important for Posey to go to school. At UMass, she could study umbral science with actual professors instead of yahtzees from the internet. Maybe she'd even discover some other interest. The only problem was the number of forms and fees and surprise charges. While Charlie had gotten together most of the money for this last bill, she didn't have it all. But she could get it once Doreen's brother came through and bought them a little more time. So Charlie fell back on the family tradition of mostly ignoring the situation and occasionally, guiltily, suggesting that her sister try to go to bed earlier, acting like her problem was insomnia. Like they didn't both know Posey was drinking buckets of coffee and soda and maybe popping Adderall to stave off exhaustion. At least that would serve her well in undergrad. Charlie had a sinking feeling that her sister already had an idea about where she was going to get DMT, and that it involved boosting something. Most likely, Charlie boosting something. Posey's cell pinged, and as she checked it, Charlie devoted herself to the drinking of her coffee. She was going to need it. "Mom pulled the 7 of Cups today," Posey muttered, holding up her phone so Charlie could see the photo of their mother holding a tarot card. The card of a daydreamer, a searcher, Their mother was living in a long-stay motel with a new guy, but there was always a new guy. She liked to have Posey weigh in on her fortunes, since divinations were free for family. Charlie ignored a familiar stab of guilt, dulled by time but never totally gone. "What are you going to tell her?" Posey scowled. "What do you care? It's not like you believe I know what I'm talking about." At her tone, Lucifer looked up from the sink and hissed. "That's not fair," Charlie said. "And you're upsetting the cat. She hates it when people fight." Posey ignored her. "There's a reason they cut shadows off people and sell them. Everyone wants magic. It's not just me." Charlie glanced automatically toward the bathroom where Vince was showering. She lowered her voice. "I wasn't criticizing you. Stop being so fucking paranoid." When Charlie was a kid, someone had given her a box of tricks for her birthday. A handkerchief that pulled inside out to change colors. A hat with a false bottom. A stack of marked cards. She'd practiced night after night. But in the end, it was just another kind of fakery. A different way of lying. Of course, Charlie knew what it was like to want magic. Posey dragged her laptop over. "Let me show you something." Charlie took another sip of coffee and started to make a pile of the mail scattered over the table. Catalogs, electric bill, propane bill, cell phone bill, another letter from the hospital marked in red, and 3 from a collection company. The total crept higher each month, with interest. Plus, she was going to have to resuscitate a 1998 Toyota Corolla before it got towed. But first, Posey. "Think about all the things that have been covered up," Charlie's little sister said. "Testing radiation on dead babies, forcing companies to poison the stuff used to make bootleg alcohol during Prohibition. And not just our government, or any government. Companies, institutions. If there was a way to quicken a shadow, they'd hide it from us." Posey turned around the screen of her computer to show a video of teenagers sneaking around a hospital. Underneath, the file claimed to be undoctored surveillance footage. The kids' eyes glowed in the green infrared light. It was creepy, seeing them giggling beside sleeping patients, snipping with their fingers like they were playing rock, paper, scissors, and only picking scissors, over and over and over. "What are they using all those shadows for?" Posey asked. "They must have a way to wake them." Charlie frowned at the screen, unimpressed. She didn't think much of shadow robbers. They were the sloppy stick-up artists of the magical crime world. And she figured shadow dealers were selling to people who'd lost their shadows through excessive alteration, or used them for experiments. If someone really knew how to quicken a shadow, it seemed unlikely to Charlie they'd just sit on that information when the world would be full of money ready to rain down on them. "You ever heard of shadows ripping?" Charlie asked, partially because she wanted to know, and partially to change the subject. Posey scowled. "What?" "I saw one last night that was, I don't know, it looked like it had been through a shredder or something. And there was a man who..." Posey stared at her so oddly that Charlie let the last sentence trail off. Posey, who believed everything, didn't appear to believe her. Charlie wished there was a way for her to prove the shadow had come from a tattered plastic bag, that the man had been wearing gray gloves. But Charlie knew what she'd seen. "Someone must have been trying to cut it off," Posey said finally. "They say it's like having your soul cut away from your body to lose a shadow." She dropped her voice to a whisper. "And you know Vince." "Oh, come on, stop," Charlie said, cutting her off. He has a fucking soul. There's something wrong with him, Posey said. He couldn't do that grim shit job of his if there wasn't. Vince cleaned hotel rooms after something happened involving a lot of blood or a body. A stabbing, a shooting, an overdose. His boss handled dispatch, farming out the work to 3 freelancers who worked off the books. Winnie, an older woman with grown children who had been a professional clown before she started this. Craig, who said he was doing it for a year to learn what gore looked like before he applied to Tom Savini's school for special effects makeup. And Vince. "You want to talk about shit jobs?" Charlie said. Posey ignored her. "He's too quiet, and I think he's been lying about speaking French." Charlie gave a weird snort laugh, surprised by the ridiculousness of the accusation and the seriousness with which Posey spoke. "He's done what now?" Posey scowled. "We were watching television and there was an episode where one of the characters said something in French and he grinned before the show explained what any of it meant. It wasn't just bonjour or whatever either. He understood an entire French joke." "So he took it in high school, so what?" Posey shook her head. "No one remembers the language they took in high school." "I've got no idea what bothers you about him," Charlie said, throwing up her hands. "And I don't think you do either." "I guess he's good looking, but there's something missing there. You text other guys behind his back." Posey grabbed Charlie's cell phone off the table. "See? Ooh, Adam, let's meet somewhere private. Give me that." Charlie grabbed it out of her hand. "Admit it. What you like best about Vince is how much he's willing to put up with." Before Charlie could explain, Vince's heavy step announced him. His hair was wet, his shirt tight over the thick, muscled part of his upper arms. His gray eyes tinted greenish from the yellow walls. Posey got up, then pushed past him, laptop tucked under her arm. She wasn't gentle either, shoving her shoulder against his chest. Vince raised his eyebrows. "She finally heading to bed?" he asked, and went to pour coffee from the pot. "Hopefully," Charlie said, forcing her gaze away. She wondered how much he'd overheard and if he'd confront her. What he might admit, if rage loosened his tongue. Would he tell her that he wished he was somewhere else, with someone else? That he was just marking time? Would he stop being so careful? Charlie Hall, imp of the perverse, appreciated a relationship for being simple and still tempted to see if she could make a complicated mess of it. Impulsively, she picked up her phone and searched for questions in French. "Voulez-vous plus de café?" she asked, stumbling over the pronunciation. He stared at her in confused alarm, which was understandable since she'd just spouted gibberish. "What?" Charlie shook her head, feeling ridiculous. "Nothing." "We better go look at your car," he said, taking a deep swallow from his mug. She bit her lip. "Okay. Yeah." Vince drove a white van, rusty parts covered with house paint. It was easily as old as Charlie's car and equally likely to give up the ghost at an inconvenient moment, although it hadn't so far. She swung herself up into the passenger seat. An old Dunkin' foam coffee cup rested in the center console, next to a phone charger with the prepaid phone he always used plugged in, and a yellowed paperback entitled Cry of Evil, with a lady on the cover holding a gun in a sexy but unlikely position. A tree-shaped air freshener hung from the mirror, only adding a layer of lemon oil to the aggressively bleach, vinegar, and Lysol smell of the back. Vince's gaze was on the road. Charlie studied his profile, his jawline, his hands on the wheel. "Last night," she said, "I think I saw a dead body." He glanced at her. "Is that what you and your sister were arguing about?" "We weren't," she started, then stopped herself. "Posey just needs someone she can shout at. She's wired from all the caffeine, irritated from not enough sleep. And there was a video of kids breaking into a hospital that bothered her." Vince didn't look as though he entirely believed her. "Where did you see the body?" "On my way home." He glanced at her, frowned. "Walking?" "I was fine," she said, as he pulled into the empty parking lot of the bar. "It was just weird. I never saw anyone dead before." He must see bodies all the time at his work. But he didn't try to one-up her by pointing that out. He didn't tell her that she shouldn't have been out alone or try to make her promise that she wouldn't do it again either. He never told her how to act or what to wear, which was, for the record, an extremely boring black V-neck t-shirt, black jeans, and checkerboard Vans. And that was good, of course. But there was a part of her that kept wanting to squabble. Like Posey, maybe she needed someone to yell at. Maybe she wanted to be yelled at. Charlie tried to swallow the impulse. She turned to sit with the door open, letting her legs dangle out of the van as Vince opened up the hood of her Corolla. He started poking at the insides, then went around to try to turn the car on. It didn't so much as shudder. "Can you tell what's wrong?" "Starter, I think," he said, frowning. It made her twitchy to sit by and watch, even though she knew next to nothing about cars. "You need me to do anything?" He shook his head. "Not at the moment." She watched him work, the bend of his body, the sureness of his hands, and the way he seemed to defy the sunlight, casting nothing on the ground. Charlie had known a local girl who'd sold her shadow. She'd been a pole dancer, over at what locals unkindly referred to as the Waitley Ballet. She finished her shift around the same time as Charlie, so they ran into each other sometimes at the few eateries open all night. "He paid me $5,000, Linda had confided in a whisper, her expression hard to read. "And it's not like I was using it." "Who paid?" Charlie had asked, taking a bite of very oily fried eggs. I'd never seen the guy before. Bought a lap dance, and that's when he made the offer. At first I laughed, but he was serious. Said there was someone who wanted a shadow just like mine. The diner had been dimly lit and Linda was sitting. From that angle, it hadn't been obvious anything was missing. "Do you notice that it's gone?" Charlie had asked, frowning at the blurred edges of her own shadow. Linda had taken a slug of her coffee. "You know when there's a word and you feel like it's at the tip of your tongue? It's like that. There was something inside me that isn't anymore, but I don't know what. I'm not sure I miss it, but I feel like I should." Every time she thought of the conversation, it made her wonder if it was how Vince felt too. But when she'd asked him about it, he'd told her he couldn't remember what it had been like before. And when she'd asked him if he wanted a new shadow, he said he didn't need one. Charlie picked up her burner phone and scrolled through the local news, looking for some mention of a body found in East Hampton. Nothing. Even though the local crime beat at the paper was so sleepy that shoplifting and drunk students got reported. Who was the dead guy? And had he really stolen a book from Lionel Salt? That rich bastard's name stood at the top of lists of donors to museums and charities and hot chocolate runs. Kids swap stories of seeing Salt's car creeping along different roads. A matte black and silver Rolls-Royce Phantom Mansory Conquistador. A car whose name guys in high school had delighted in saying in its entirety so often that it lodged in the head like an earwormed song. But most people hadn't been inside Salt's horror show of a house, or watched him poison someone in the hopes of stealing a quickened shadow. If there were a different set of rules for the rich, Lionel Salt operated without rules at all. Just thinking about him made Charlie nervous. She turned her mind back to the dead guy. He'd ordered bourbon and paid with a card, which meant there'd be a receipt in Odette's office with his name on it. If she knew who he was, she'd be able to ask around, find out more about what he thought he'd been doing. Her phone buzzed, and it took her a moment to realize it was her burner. Adam, we haven't talked payment. This was why Adam needed Balthazar as a go-between, not just for anonymity, but because Balthazar would have nailed down the cash immediately. Since she wasn't planning on paying him anyway, she could have promised any amount. But she figured she'd take the opportunity to find out just how much bliss he'd been rolling. "Can we work something out?" she texted. The reply came quickly. "What kind of connections do you have?" Charlie frowned. She'd expected him to bring up bliss, not whatever this was about. "I know people," she wrote. He took a moment to respond, and when he did, it was a long message. "I have something that I need to move, something big, but I don't want anyone to know it's me making the deal. Act like it's you and I'll get your thing for free." A job like the one she was offering could have gotten him $1,000, easy. Twice that if the client was desperate. What could Adam have that he needed to hide? He was, by all accounts, not a particularly skilled thief. And he had Balthazar to move things for him. "Sure," she wrote. "Who are you making the deal with?" He typed his message back fast. "All you'll have to do is talk on the hotel phone. I'll tell you what to say." Charlie noticed Vince watching her and shoved her phone guiltily into her pocket. "How did you learn about cars?" "I told you my grandfather was strict, right?" Vince said, his attention returning to the guts of the Corolla. "He taught me lots of stuff. He believed in the improving power of work no matter how old you were. He didn't believe in excuses. And he had a limo that broke down sometimes." "So he was a livery driver?" Charlie asked. "He let you ride in the back sometimes?" He shrugged. "Dropped me off the first day of high school. Everyone stared at me like I was somebody." She tried to picture him back then. Had he been a gangly kid who ate 2 lunches and never filled out? The boy who sat in the back of the class and read comics? The track star? Nothing fit. "You wouldn't have liked me," Charlie told him, bumping the toe of her sneakers against the van door. "I was a weird kid." Her boobs came in at 10, crusting over the tops of her Walmart bras. Between that and her home life, she'd kept her head down until high school, when she found ways to make herself look scary. Oversized clothes, lots of eyeliner, and hair that hung in her face. Frankenstein boots that she wore until the soles peeled off. Vince gave her a heavy-lidded look, and she wondered if he was going to make a joke. "I like weird," he said instead, and went back to disconnecting something on the car. He had no idea. A few moments later, Odette's shiny purple Mini Cooper pulled into the lot. She got out, a voluminous black caftan billowing around her. The faded facial tattoos on her papery skin and the heavy silver piercings along her lips, cheek, and all the way up her ears made it clear that she'd been a badass while they were still in diapers. She strode over to them, giving a wave with a gloved hand that had metal claws attached to the tips of the cloth. "You're a tall drink of water," Odette said, looking Vincent up and down. Her gaze didn't travel to the asphalt, to his missing shadow. Vince wiped a hand on his pants and stuck it out. "Vince," he said, "you must be Odette. Heard a lot about you." Charlie wondered what her boss saw when she looked up at him. He had dirty fingernails from working on the car, a lot of dark blonde hair covering his face, gray eyes that looked hollow in the wrong light. Handsome, in that broad-shouldered, hard-jawed way that seems to defy decadence. Handsome enough to annoy her when people looked at him, and then at her, and drew unflattering conclusions. After a beat, Odette gave him her hand as though she were a queen bestowing it to a knight. "All bad, I hope." "Awful," he agreed, giving her a lopsided smile. Odette winked at Charlie. "The quiet ones always do surprise you," she said. Then she headed inside. Vince was almost done with the repair when Alexis parked behind Rapture, as far from them as possible. A white-haired man in mirrored sunglasses got out. He had a sport coat on and immaculate boat shoes. "Is that guy lost?" Vince asked. "He's probably a client," Charlie told him. Odette still had a few. "Huh," Vince said. The man had to pass by them on his way to the main entrance. He kept glancing in their direction nervously. "Some of the guys have been tied up by her for 4 decades, Charlie whispered. That was a decade and change longer than she'd been alive. "Rich," Vince said. "No doubt," Charlie agreed. "It's funny. None of them are ever what I expect. He looks like a regular businessman, the kind of guy who'd have a winter house in Florida, brag about his grandkids, vote Republican, have a puppeteer on staff for corporate espionage, but be too nervous to look them in the eye." Vince squinted at the man. He's wearing a Vacheron Constantine watch. South of France, for the house. He can afford it. Charlie frowned. I hope she hits him extra hard. Vince turned back to the engine, and Charlie watched flies buzz around the lot. As the afternoon stretched late, it came to her that it was odd for Vince to know about a watch so fancy that she'd never even heard of it. Maybe his grandfather with the limo knew about rich people. Or maybe Vince took stuff people left in hotel rooms. The idea that he might have secrets bothered Charlie, even though she had plenty. But he wasn't supposed to be like her. "Tell me about some of Odette's other clients," he said, "while I work." Vince loved gossip, even about people he didn't know. If you met him, silent and 6 foot whatever, you wouldn't think it, but he'd listen and comment, like the stories mattered. He remembered the details. Sometimes she wished he wouldn't. It made her worried he was going to see through her patter and figure out the real reason she'd left the game. Charlie had spent so many years in it, robbing libraries, museums, antiquarian book fairs, lied and charmed and conned, picked pockets and locks, and even once trapped a blight in an onyx binding box. She might not have been magic, but she'd cross-pollinated the magical world like a bee. Glomus didn't have spells, per se, but they had notes on techniques and experiments done by glooms through the ages. At first, there was a movement to digitize and share them in a large online free library. until people began to upload hacked versions. The library was formally dismantled after a copy of the Cosmometria Mnemonica was uploaded, detailing a way for Glomus to gain power by pushing past previous limits by feeding an open stream of life energy to their shadow. 30 Glomus died before it became clear that the critical last part, which explained how to calculate how much was too much and cut off the supply, had been deleted from the PDF version. Ever since, Glomists guarded what they had and were suspicious of anything they couldn't authenticate, which led to hiring people like Charlie to get originals. It was scary work, dealing with people who could rip out a part of her. Once, caught, a Glomus altered Charlie's shadow so that she was so filled with terror that she trembled in her closet for the better part of a week. Not only that, but cons required her to become other people. When she came up for air between jobs, Charlie wouldn't quite know who she was. She'd get another tattoo, as though it could root her in place. She'd get drunk. Maybe she'd find someone to break her heart, burn through a chunk of cash, squirrel the rest away, and then do it all over again. It ended when she stole a volume for Vicereign, the head of a local gang of alterationists who called themselves the Artists. A 19th century memoir, not easy to get off the puppeteer in Albany who'd lifted it from some guy in Atlanta. Charlie had taken a month to worm herself into the right position to get her hands on it. Then, Charlie's boyfriend, a cowardly shitlord named Mark, tried to sell it out from under her. He made a side deal with another gang for far less than the book was worth. Like Posey, he wanted a quickened shadow and was willing to believe that Glomists could help him. Charlie could have told him that she discovered what he was trying to do and dumped his ass. But no, Charlie needed to make her point by circling it in fire. When he tried to make the exchange, Mark discovered that the book was blank. Charlie had carefully removed the cover and replaced the insides with a college-ruled notebook from Target. For the insult, they cut off Mark's shadow and all the fingers of his right hand. He'd been a musician. Charlie tried to tell herself that he deserved it, and that it wasn't her fault. But that didn't stop her from crashing hard into depression and self-loathing. Back then she was working at Bar 10, and after her shift, she'd lie in bed until she had to work again, too exhausted to move. Eventually, she lost her job, started burning through her savings. A couple months later, Mark and his brother shot up her car while it was stopped at a light. Only one bullet hit her. But that was plenty. 2 hit the guy in the passenger seat, a hookup, who died immediately. It haunted her that Posey could have been sitting in his place. Mark and his brother went straight to prison, where they were rotting to this day. All of it because Charlie had needed to show off, to exact revenge. Charlie Hall, at her best when doing her worst. Whenever she tried to create something, it broke apart in her hands. But blowing something up? There, Charlie had an unerring instinct for greatness. No more stealing magic, she told herself as she recovered. No more Glomists, no more cons. No more living her life with the volume turned up to 11. No more putting the people she loved in danger. She'd lost her nerve. Not long after the bandages came off, she hooked up with Vince. When she'd noticed him next to her at the bar, her first impulse had been to move as far away as possible. He had a hard jaw, big hands, and angry eyebrows. He was hunched over his drink like he wanted to punch it. She'd had a bad day and a bad month and a worse year, and was exhausted by the idea of getting hassled. But he waved down the bartender when she was being ignored, and interposed himself between her and the press of the evening crowd. When he spoke, it was to ask her the sort of questions that didn't demand much. She liked his deep voice and the strangeness of his eyes, so pale a gray that they seemed barely a color at all. She appreciated that he hadn't hit on her, and he wasn't bad-looking. Objectively, he was far hotter than the guys to whom she was usually attracted. Pretty, sad, skinny, whippet-faced fast-talkers. Objectively, he looked like he could snap them in half. Maybe she needed something different, a nicotine patch of a man, something to draw off her worst impulses, at least for one night. Outside the bar, he'd traced the tattoo of roses and winged beetles along her throat, his fingers gentle. But when she'd twined her arms around his neck and kissed him, he'd pressed her against the rough bricks with all the fervor she could want. His height and the strength of his arms suddenly a real and previously unknown advantage. She took him home, and in the morning he was still there. He made coffee and brought it to her on the mattress, along with toast that was only slightly burnt at the edges. Maybe she loved him a little right then, although she would have never admitted it to herself. He was looking for a place, he said. Did she know anyone with a room to rent? But Charlie never let herself forget that Vince's life with her was a kind of exile. He kept a picture of himself with another woman, one he never talked about, in his wallet. That first night she'd looked through it and found $10, a driver's license from Minnesota, and the photo, worn thin from the touch of his fingers. Every now and again she'd pickpocket him again, to check. It was always there. 5. Inside Out. Although they managed to drive the Corolla home, slowly, it made an alarming clunking noise, and Vince thought he needed a part that it was too late to get. He offered to drop her back at Rapture for her shift, but he wasn't likely to be back from his cleaning job in time to pick her up. Charlie arranged for her friend Barb to give her a lift home, not wanting to be alone on the street again. Barb was a line cook at a vegan restaurant in Northampton that stopped seating at 11 on Fridays. By the time they got the last table turned over, the kitchen clean, and the next day's food prepped, it was close enough to 1 in the morning for the timing to work out. Standing outside, huddled in her coat, Charlie watched Balthazar leave with Joey Aspirins. She couldn't help thinking of the nameless murdered man and his tattered shadow. Couldn't help wondering if Balthazar had ratted the guy out to Salt. She hoped not. She wanted to keep on liking Balthazar. When she was a kid, she'd imagined making Salt pay for what he'd done to her. But the idea of revenge was childish, and it died with her childhood. Charlie was pragmatic. People like her didn't get back at people like Salt. Still, she couldn't help wondering about the Liber Noctem. This book he was apparently desperate to get back. Wondered what it would be like to have something he wanted. To have the power to take something from him. Then Charlie reminded herself that she didn't want to wind up a corpse in an alley. And definitely not the alley just around the corner from her rental house. If she was going to get murdered, she'd like to do it in Paris or Tokyo. What she did want was her sister in college and her debts paid. Well, that was what she wanted to want. You can't quit, Balthazar had told her when she informed him she wasn't taking jobs. You're too good. This is the only thing you're good at. Sometimes Charlie worried he was right about that second part. Idly, she took out her phone and tapped out Liber Noctem into the search window. An auction notice from Sotheby's came up. Liber Noctem, colloquially called the Book of Blights, each letter individually stamped into pages comprised of a nickel alloy, created in 1831 in Scotland by its anonymous author. The book is one of the most significant documents related to the phenomenon of disembodied shadow manifestations. Rumors of an actual blight being involved in the writing of the book are unconfirmed, but add to its historical significance. Catalog note: Sotheby's does not endorse carrying out any of the rituals in this book and will ask the buyer to sign papers indemnifying Sotheby's from any and all related damages. Bidding begins at 520,000 GBP. The picture that accompanied it was of a silvery book with elaborate clasps, like an old Bible. Not exactly an easy thing to hide. Could that be what Adam had and was trying to move? What he wanted Amber to take the fall for? Barb pulled up in her slightly dented electric blue minivan, startling Charlie out of her thoughts. Barb powered down the window and cracked a huge smile. "Get in, baby cakes." Charlie tossed her bag onto the floor of the passenger side and climbed up after it. Barbara Panganiban was easily her favorite of the people she'd met in the course of getting, and then losing, bartending jobs all over the valley. "A bunch of people are at my house tonight," Barb told her, throwing the car into reverse. Her thick black hair was pulled into an olive-colored headscarf, and her cook's jacket hung open over a singlet. "I thought about saying something earlier, but I figured it'd be easier to kidnap you." Several times a month, usually on the weekends, Barb and her girlfriend Amy played host to a rotating crew of restaurant workers and other people with shifts that finished after midnight. Barb would make a giant pot of pancit, with the recipe her grandmother handed down to her mom back in the Philippines, or defrost arroz caldo, and everyone else would either bring something, mostly liquor, or make something, often experimental. Charlie used to show up regularly, back when she and Barb worked together. But then there'd been a con in Worcester, then the even weirder thing in Albany, and then she'd gotten shot. By the time she'd met Vince, her attendance had grown spotty. Still, Charlie should have thought to check the Slack where the dates were posted. If she had, she wouldn't have been caught by surprise. "Oh, come on," Barb said. "Amy misses you." That seemed unlikely. Amy was about 10 years older than Barb, skinny, and so quiet that even when she spoke, it was in a whisper. Charlie couldn't tell if she secretly enjoyed the extreme extrovert energy of these gatherings, or if Amy just loved Barb so much that she was willing to put up with her girlfriend's nightmarish idea of fun. Either way, Charlie had never gotten the impression that Amy had fully committed her to memory. "If you don't mind me being empty-handed, maybe it would do her some good to have a night out. If she went home, she'd just think about whether Adam had Salt's book and if she could get it, or argue with Posey about acquiring DMT. Vince can pick me up when he gets off work." "Tell him to come in," Barb said. "I want to meet this mystery guy. Do you know how hard it is to find someone in the valley that a friend hasn't already gotten with?" Charlie sure did. 15 minutes later, they pulled into the crowded driveway of an old farmhouse in the shadow of Mount Tom and backing into the Oxbow part of the Connecticut River. It had been in Amy's family and come to her after the death of a great aunt. The place was sprawling, with the last significant updates having been done in the 50s. A finicky, mustard-colored electric stove occupied a corner of the kitchen, and a burnt orange shag rug ran through everywhere else, including the bathrooms. They entered to music from a Sonos that at least 3 people were trying to control at the same time. The air smelled like ginger, fried onions, and pizza. Amy, in leggings and a tank that showed off tattoos of koi running down both her arms, half hiding behind butt-length brown hair, drifted over to kiss Barb. She whispered to Charlie that the drinks and food were in the dining room and that they were out of ice. Charlie thanked her, and deciding she couldn't follow Barb around like a duckling, wove through the main area toward the booze. She passed Angel and Ian on the rug, playing what appeared to be chess with a mix of snack food for the pieces. Ian had a vape pen hanging on one corner of his mouth, as though it were an old-timey cigar. Both of them worked over at Cosmica, a diner-style restaurant that served buffalo meat burgers and a lot of cocktails. When Ian noticed her, his mouth opened far enough for the vape pen to fall on the board and send a cheese puff rolling into a potato chip. She and Ian had slept together late one night, when neither of them were making good decisions. She hoped that wasn't going to make the evening awkward. A guy was sitting on the couch, head buried in his sketchbook. She recognized him as a webcomic artist. He'd been creating a surprisingly explicit and sprawling story of a mouse warrior for years, but it had only recently started gaining a big readership. There was a rumor that he'd begun making serious money. The long-haired man sitting next to him must have thought he was doing well, since he was trying to convince him to invest in a weed truck, like an ice cream truck but selling edibles and joints and creams. It would drive around neighborhoods and, long-hair man insisted, be really good for older people with mobility issues. There was some question from the people sitting nearby about whether this was legal. But the really heated debate was around which celebratory weed song the truck should play. That led to the subject of Rolling Bliss, which several of them had done. I went to this alterationist, Raven, out in Pittsfield, long-hair man said. And she got me so joyed up, I almost walked out in front of a semi. Worth it, though. It was like that feeling you get when you're a kid and summer's just started, combined with all the optimism of first love. In the kitchen, Don argued with his girlfriend, Erin. They were a dramatic couple, prone to tears and shouting about which had been mean to the other first. Don was a bartender at Top Hat, a nice place, one of the first Charlie had been fired from. She poured 4 fingers of Old Crow bourbon into a plastic cup and sidled past Don and Erin to get some ice from the freezer before she remembered there wasn't any. She settled for a little cold water to cut the burn. Don bent his head to hide that he was wiping his eyes. At least it wasn't her crying in the kitchen this time. Charlie Hall! Jose called. Long time. You don't like us anymore? He was standing in a little knot with Caitlin and Susie Lambden, who had made that comment to Doreen about Charlie being like the devil. Have you heard from him? Jose demanded as she approached them. He worked at a tiny gay bar called Mailbox, where he'd met his ex, the one who'd moved to Los Angeles for a guy and stuck Charlie with double shifts. Charlie shook her head. But Odette might have an address to send his last check on file, if you want to send him a haunted object or something. Or there's a service that ships packages filled with glitter to your enemies. They don't call it the herpes of crafting for nothing. He gave her a wan smile but was clearly sunk in misery. He's probably basking in the sun, happy, eating avocados off the trees in his backyard, having sex with a hot surfer every night. Meanwhile, I will never find love. I told you, Caitlin said. I'll fix you up with my cousin. Isn't he the one who ate a dead moth off the bathroom floor? Jose raised his eyebrows. As a child, you can't hold that against him, Caitlin protested. I should just get a gloom to cut my feelings right out of me, Jose declared dramatically. Maybe then I'd be happy. You can't be happy without feelings, Caitlin said, pedantic to the end. Charlie appeared to have arrived at the exact point in the night where everyone had drunk too much and become either belligerent or morose. She slung back the old crow. She'd better catch up. "I heard Doreen was looking for you," Susie said, as Caitlin and Jose continued to argue over whether a mouth tainted by a moth could ever be enjoyably kissed. Susie had on a billowy sleeve dress in a yellow pattern and a large, chunky necklace. Her dark hair was pulled up into a tortoise-shell clip. She wore the kind of thrift store finds that cost more than new clothes. Some of the people at the party might have heard that Charlie had fixed things for someone in a jam, or had a vaguely criminal side gig, but were light on the details. They saw what they expected to see. Charlie Hall, perennial fuck-up, who had a hard time holding down a job and was willing to make out when she got really drunk. Susie Lambton knew a little more. When she was at Hampshire, a professor had tried to have her tossed out for plagiarizing a paper. Charlie found the way to change his mind. She shrugged. "Adam's in the wind. She wants me to find him for her. Convince him to go home." "If I were you, I wouldn't get involved in his mess," Susie told her. "When people get to a certain age, either they change or they curdle. He's pushing 30 and wants to live like he's 20. Wants to come into work drunk from the night before, gamble, that kind of shit. I'm going on a yoga retreat next weekend. You should come with me instead." "Too late," Charlie said, lifting her plastic cup in a salute. "To wise advice and bad decisions." Susie, who probably had plagiarized her paper, raised her glass. Vince rolled up a half hour later, with orange juice and ice, having received Charlie's text the party was low on both. She went over and hugged him, burying her face in the wool of his coat. It carried the scent of leaves and cold night air. A small smile lifted one corner of his mouth, and she felt a swell of strange, bittersweet longing for someone who was already hers. Tina, who worked at the Hampshire Gazette and drank like a journalist in a movie, was loudly musing about getting her shadow altered to have a cat tail. "Guys love a tail," Tina proclaimed, to protests by nearly everyone. Amy thought Tina shouldn't consider fetishes along a gender binary. Ian wanted it to be known that he thought it was disgusting and that men did not want to molest animals. The artist agreed that it was kind of hot, but his comic was about saucy mice. Charlie told Tina that maybe she had misunderstood what getting some tail actually meant. "Mermaids, right?" Vince asked, in such a clueless, just-joined-the-conversation tone that it was hard to know if he was joking or if he'd misheard the earlier part. It didn't matter. Everyone laughed. It was funny either way. As Charlie poured more bourbon, with ice this time, she decided she was glad she'd come. She was just buzzed enough to feel an expansive warmth for the people in the room. See, she was fine being a normal person and doing normal person things. She ate some cheese that Tina made from the milk of her own goats, in which no one had the heart to tell her tasted weird, and smiled for absolutely no reason. Then she heard Ian, speaking loudly enough to drown out the Sonos. "Hey, Vince! What's the worst thing you've ever seen at that job of yours?" His tone made it into a challenge. Vince looked up from the winged armchair where he sat, caught mid-conversation with Susie and Jose. The chair, Charlie noted, looked as though it had been shredded by a cat, and bits of stuffing showed along the arms. "None of it's great," Vince said, clearly attempting to deflect the conversation. "Yeah, but there must be something. An eyeball in the sink, hair on the ceiling. Come on." Ian grinned in an entirely unfriendly way. "Entertain us." Charlie had been feeling pretty good until that moment. Her current boyfriend wasn't sulking in a corner, or saying something obnoxious, or picking a fight, the way that past ones had. Vince was willing to listen and make the sort of encouraging noises that kept people going. Catnip to the self-involved. But no matter how much any of her friends were getting along with Vince, the night was about to go bad anyway. "Ian," Charlie said, trying to make her voice as stern as Odette wielding a cat-o'-nine-tails in her back office. He smirked at her, and she was suddenly sure that this wasn't about being unpleasantly curious. It was about some weird feeling Ian had about Charlie. He wanted to prove something to her, or ruin something for her. "I'm just asking a question. Getting to know the guy. I mean, if you're fuck..." Vince interrupted him, pushing himself out of the chair. "Once I saw someone turned entirely inside out." Charlie was used to him hunching a bit, trying not to take up too much space or be too intimidating. Not with his shoulders back, the muscles in his arms tense. His voice sounded as calm as ever, but the hair stood up along her arms. Bones and organs and fingers and toes. Everything. Like a sock. Inside. Out. "Really?" Ian asked, impressed. "No," Vince said, stone-faced. People nearby laughed. Even Charlie laughed, surprised into it. "Fine, asshole. I won't ask you about your stupid job," Ian said, moving in close. Getting up in his face, daring to get hit. When Vince didn't react, Ian gave him a shove. Vince let himself be pushed back, but there was a barely restrained glee in his eyes she had never seen there before. "It's just a lot of picking bits of brain off walls. Nothing much to tell." For a moment, the two men stared at one another. A moment later, Ian blanched and ducked his head. "I didn't know you'd be so boring," he muttered. Vince sat back down with a shrug, as though nothing had happened. As though nothing had been about to happen. Charlie was heading over to apologize when Susie Lampton perched herself on the arm of Vince's chair. She touched Vince's shoulder as she said something, tossed her hair, laughed. Vince smiled in return, one of his real smiles. Charlie had a sudden and almost overwhelming urge to knock her to the ground. She drank a slug of bourbon instead. "You know, you can't make her catch on fire just by staring like that," Barb said. "Busted." Charlie looked away. "I wasn't." Barb laughed. "Go over and tell him he did good. It's not easy to let some little guy insult you." "I'm sure Vince is fine," Charlie said, scowling a little. "He never gets riled." What he did get was hit on. Vince, with hair the color of old gold, was a lot of people's type. Charlie had a gaudy kind of beauty. Nothing understated in her curves. No subtlety to her cleavage. Maybe Susie thought she had a shot. Susie was pursuing a master's degree at Smith. Rumor had it that her wealthy parents still paid her rent. Was able to do that yoga move where you stood on your head. Maybe she did have a shot. "Harsh," Barb said, "abandoning him to the wolves." "Well, just one wolf, but you know what I mean." Charlie shrugged. "Don't blame me if you wind up in a throuple." Charlie rolled her eyes, heading for the wraparound porch outside. She needed to get some air. The intensity of her anger at Susie bothered her. She didn't get jealous, not like that. It didn't make sense to long for someone who was already yours. "It's the alcohol," she told herself, as she sat on a porch swing that she hoped wasn't full of spiders. Most of the nearby houses didn't have lights on, but a scattered few caught her eye. The soft glow of a pink nightlight in a child's room. A television, the screen moving between images. A beacon burning over a garage door, waiting for someone to return. This area had all been farms once. Tobacco, probably. You still passed old drying barns on the back roads. Out past the highway was the Connecticut River, a black snake curling around Mount Tom until it shed its skin and became the Chicopee River, then the Swift River, and finally, the Quabbin Reservoir. Charlie remembered walking around there when she was a kid on a field trip at school. They went to see a fish hatchery and then climbed the observation tower. Charlie had stood at the top and looked down into the water, wondering if she could see the drowned buildings beneath the waves. The Quabbin was a human-made reservoir, created by flooding 4 towns. And while the residents had relocated, their homes, shops, and halls remained. They were still down there, with whatever had been left inside. Secret, unless you knew where to look. And how. She thought of shadows moving in the dark, as impossible to spot as drowned towns. "You ready?" Vince asked, the door closing heavily behind him. She jumped, surprised. His eyes looked eerie in the porch light. Silver. "No throuple?" she asked after a moment. He frowned at her in the same confused way he had when she'd read the French phrase off her phone. She wished she could make him tell her what he was thinking. Of course, it was possible he was just thinking that he was tired, annoyed with her friends, and wanted to go home. Or it was possible that he was thinking there was something seriously wrong with her. Never mind. She got up from the swing and dusted off her pants. Charlie needed to stop looking for trouble where there was none. She needed to stop looking for trouble. Period. At home, she got ready for bed, washing her face and putting on a t-shirt. She moved to climb over Vince to her side of the mattress. When he put his hand on her hip, she paused, straddling his chest. Outside their window, the moon was a bright silver coin in the black sky, lighting the room well enough to see the intensity of his gaze. He reached up to thread his fingers through her hair. "Your friends are nice." His mouth curved up on one side. Mostly. She wondered if he was going to ask her about Ian. "You were a hit." "Because I brought ice," he said, clearly not believing her. "Everyone loves the guy who brings ice." She could have explained how bad the previous guys she'd brought around were, and how great Vince seemed by comparison. But that didn't reflect well on either of them. "I certainly do," she said, before realizing what that meant. She'd intended to be funny, to imply, "I love ice," not "I love you." But he didn't seem alarmed, and after a moment the sharp spike of panic faded. She was just drunk. Drunk people said stupid things. "Come a little closer," he told her. As she bent toward him, his thumb went to her cheekbone, brushing lightly over her skin. Her hair fell around them in a canopy. He levered up to kiss her, mouth careful, as though she was something fragile and precious. Spun sugar, the wing of a butterfly, someone who wasn't a human callus, or a rock ready to be thrown through a window. Someone who wasn't Charlie Hall. Maybe that was how he thought he was supposed to kiss girls. The way he'd kiss the girl whose picture was in his wallet. Maybe he wanted to be respectful. But every time he did it, Charlie couldn't help thinking of it as a challenge. She reached down, hand on his chest, fingers sliding beneath the waistband of his sleep pants. She loved how his breath caught, went uneven, loved the way that when he kissed her again, his mouth was looser, his tongue dirtier. Pulling away, she squirmed out of her panties, kicking them to one side of the bed, not bothering to take off her shirt. Then she crawled back on her hands and knees. He bent over her, covering her body with his. His mouth went to her throat, to her shoulder, his fingers tracing over the part of her breast just above her heart. When pleasure hit at the base of her spine, she let it carry her past all regrets.